There's a sound the human body makes falling through open air that I still hear sometimes. In the space between sleep and waking, a rushing silence broken only by my own breath catching in my throat. I want you to sit with that sound for a moment, because it's the sound that begins this story, though it took me years to understand it wasn't actually the sound of an ending. My name is Renata Ashford, and I was 26 years old the afternoon my stepfather pushed me off a cliff and told the rest of the world I had simply wandered off alone. My mother, Colette, had married Preston Ashford when I was 19, a whirlwind courtship that swept her, still raw from my father's death 3 years earlier, into a life of considerable wealth and, though neither of us understood it yet, considerable danger. Preston had built a shipping and logistics empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars, charming and generous in public, meticulous and controlling in ways that only fully revealed themselves once you were already too entangled in his world to easily leave. I hadn't wanted to go on that hiking trip. I want you to know that clearly, because for years afterward, in the version of events Preston told everyone, my own reluctance became evidence of some private instability, some troubled inner life that made my eventual disappearance seem tragically plausible rather than suspicious. We were 3 days into a company retreat disguised as a family vacation, hiking a remote trail along a coastal cliffside that Preston had specifically chosen. I understood far too late, for its isolation. My mother had stayed behind at the lodge that afternoon, exhausted from the previous day's hike, which meant it was only Preston and me on that particular stretch of trail when he suggested we pause at an overlook for photographs. I remember the view. I remember the wind. I remember Preston's hand on my shoulder, gentle at first, the way it had been countless times before it wasn't gentle anymore, before it became something else entirely, a sudden, decisive push that sent me over an edge I hadn't even registered as dangerous until I was already falling through open air. I remember thinking with strange, detached clarity as the ground rushed toward me, that I finally understood exactly what my mother's new husband actually was. I didn't die that afternoon. 5 years later, I walked into Preston Ashford's boardroom as the new owner of everything he'd built on the lie of my death. I fell nearly 60 feet before a dense cluster of coastal scrub brush and a shallow pool of water broke my fall enough to keep me alive, though not enough to keep me unbroken. I shattered my pelvis, fractured my spine in 2 places, suffered a traumatic brain injury that erased nearly 6 hours surrounding the fall itself, memories I've never fully recovered even now. I was found the following morning by a fisherman named Gerard Okafor, who'd noticed something unusual in the water below the cliffside and rowed closer out of simple curiosity, a decision that saved my life in ways I'm still, years later, trying to properly thank him for. I spent the following 4 months in a hospital 300 miles from the cliff where I'd fallen, transferred there during the confused, chaotic days immediately following my rescue. My identity initially unknown due to the severity of my injuries and the remote location where I'd been found. By the time hospital staff finally connected my identity to the missing persons report already circulating about a young woman who'd wandered off alone during a family hiking trip, Preston Ashford had already spent 2 full weeks giving tearful, devastated interviews about his stepdaughter's tragic disappearance. I woke from a medically induced coma to learn that the entire world, including my own mother, believed I had simply walked away from that trail and vanished, presumed dead in the surrounding wilderness. My body never recovered. I want to explain something crucial here, something that took me years of careful, quiet investigation to fully understand. I didn't immediately correct that narrative once I regained consciousness. I couldn't. The brain injury had left me temporarily unable to speak clearly, and more importantly, something instinctive and self-protective, some animal understanding buried deep beneath the trauma, told me that revealing my survival immediately might be more dangerous than staying hidden until I understood exactly what had happened and why. A social worker named Delphine Kouassi, assigned to my case given my unknown status, became the first person I trusted enough to whisper the truth to. 3 weeks into my recovery, once speech slowly began returning to me. My stepfather pushed me, I told her, my voice barely functional, watching her expression shift from professional concern to genuine alarm. He told everyone I wandered off. He needs to keep believing that's true, at least for now, until I understand why he did it. Delphine, to her enormous credit, didn't immediately report my survival to authorities or family. Instead, she listened, carefully, professionally, and helped me understand that I had options most people in my situation never realize they possess. I had no idea, lying in that hospital bed relearning how to speak, exactly how much careful, patient investigation those 5 years of hidden survival would eventually require. Are you enjoying the story? Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. If you're enjoying it so far, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Because believe me, this story is only getting started. Now, let's get back into it. Delphine connected me, during my 3rd month of recovery, with a private investigator named Marcus Delacroix, a careful, methodical man who specialized in exactly the kind of quiet, patient investigation my situation demanded. If you go public now, Marcus explained during our first meeting, his voice measured and serious, your stepfather learns immediately that you survived, that you might remember what happened, and he has every opportunity to either flee, destroy evidence, or worse, given what you're telling me about what he already attempted once. I understood the logic immediately, painfully, though it meant committing to something far more difficult than simply revealing my survival and pressing charges. It meant staying hidden, presumed dead, while Marcus quietly built a case documenting exactly what Preston Ashford had done and why. The why, I learned during those first careful months of investigation, was more complicated and more damning than simple cruelty. Preston's shipping empire, it turned out, had been built partially on my father's original company, a smaller but respected logistics business my father had founded years before his death, one that Preston had acquired through what appeared, on paper, to be a legitimate business transaction shortly after marrying my mother. Except Marcus discovered, through months of careful document review, that the transaction hadn't been entirely legitimate at all. My father's will, it turned out, had specified that I would inherit controlling interest in his company once I turned 25. A provision Preston had apparently discovered and quietly worked to circumvent through a series of complicated legal maneuvers involving my mother's power of attorney during a period when she'd been, understandably, emotionally devastated and vulnerable following my father's death. He needed you gone before your 20th birthday complications fully surfaced, Marcus explained, laying documents across a table in the small, anonymous apartment Delphine had helped me secure under an assumed identity. You turned 26 3 months before that hiking trip, which means the deadline he needed to circumvent had already technically passed. My best theory is he discovered you'd recently started asking questions about your father's original company structure, questions that might have eventually led you to discover exactly what he'd done. I sat with that information for a long time, understanding, with cold, clarifying horror, that Preston hadn't pushed me off that cliff in some moment of impulsive rage. He had planned it, carefully, deliberately, protecting an inheritance he'd stolen through legal manipulation he believed I was getting dangerously close to uncovering. I had no idea, absorbing that revelation in that small anonymous apartment, exactly how many more layers of Preston's deception Marcus's continued investigation would eventually uncover. The following 2 years unfolded as a strange, suspended existence, living under an assumed identity Delphine and Marcus helped me carefully construct, working quietly, methodically, to physically recover while Marcus continued building an increasingly comprehensive case against my stepfather. I underwent multiple surgeries during that period, slowly rebuilding a body that had been fundamentally broken, learning to walk again with a determination that surprised even the physical therapists who worked with me. A woman named Ada Orabello becoming not just my therapist, but something closer to a genuine friend through months of painful, incremental progress. I want to be honest that those years were far from a straightforward path toward justice. There were nights I questioned whether staying hidden was actually protecting me or simply prolonging my own suffering. Nights I nearly called my mother directly, desperate for the comfort of her voice despite everything Marcus's investigation suggested about her own complicated, possibly unwitting involvement in Preston's manipulations. Marcus discovered, during the second year of investigation, something that reshaped my understanding of my mother's role in everything that had happened. Your mother wasn't complicit, he told me during one of our regular meetings, sliding financial documents across the table. If anything, the evidence suggests Preston deliberately isolated her during the period immediately following your father's death, controlling her access to information, managing her medications for grief and anxiety in ways that appear, frankly, designed to keep her compliant and confused during exactly the window when he was restructuring your father's company. I felt something complicated shift in my chest reading those documents, old resentment toward my mother's apparent absence during my recovery tangling with new, painful understanding that she might have been every bit as manipulated and controlled as I had been, simply through subtler, more sustained methods than a single decisive push off a cliff. Is she safe? I asked Marcus, the question surprising me with how quickly it emerged, protective instinct apparently surviving everything I'd been through. As far as we can tell, Marcus said carefully. But Renata, I need you to understand something important before we go further. Preston has continued expanding the business significantly since your disappearance, using what appears to be your father's original company assets as collateral for increasingly aggressive acquisitions. If our case is going to hold up completely, we need comprehensive documentation of exactly how deep this goes, not just enough to prove what happened on that cliff. I understood, sitting in that small apartment 2 years into my hidden recovery, that justice would require more patience than I'd initially anticipated, more careful documentation than a single dramatic revelation could provide. I had no idea, agreeing to continue that patient documentation, exactly how much longer this careful, hidden reconstruction of my life would ultimately require. By the 3rd year of my hidden recovery, Marcus's investigation had expanded into something considerably larger than the personal case against Preston I'd initially imagined pursuing. Your father's original company wasn't the only business Preston acquired through questionable means, Marcus explained during a meeting that fundamentally shifted the scope of everything we'd been building. We found evidence of at least 3 other smaller logistics companies he absorbed through similarly manipulative tactics over the past decade, all following a pattern that suggests deliberate, calculated predation rather than isolated incidents. I sat with that revelation, understanding that Preston's cruelty toward me had been merely one instance of a much broader pattern, one that had likely harmed numerous other people whose stories I'd never fully understand. During this period, I also began, cautiously, rebuilding skills I'd need for whatever came after the hidden years of recovery finally ended. I'd studied business administration before the fall, a degree I'd never had the opportunity to fully utilize given how quickly I'd become entangled in Preston's world after my mother's remarriage. Now, working under my assumed identity, I completed advanced coursework in corporate law and forensic accounting, driven by a stubborn, focused determination to understand every possible dimension of what Preston had built and how, eventually, to dismantle it properly. Delphine, who'd remained a steady, protective presence throughout these years, introduced me during this period to an attorney named Yusuf Abra, who specialized in complex corporate fraud cases and who reviewed Marcus's accumulating evidence with growing, careful interest. This is significant, Yusuf told me during our first meeting, reviewing documents spread across his desk. Between the will provisions Preston circumvented, the pattern of predatory acquisitions Marcus has documented, and eventually, your own testimony about what happened on that cliff, we're looking at a case that could not only secure justice for what happened to you personally, but potentially restore controlling interest in your father's original company, and, depending on how the broader fraud allegations develop, possibly considerably more than that. I asked him carefully what considerably more might actually mean in practical terms. If the pattern of fraudulent acquisitions holds up under full legal scrutiny, Yusuf said, choosing his words with obvious care, there's a reasonable path toward you gaining controlling interest in Ashford Logistics entirely, not just your father's original company folded back into it. I want to be clear, this would require years more careful documentation and eventually a willingness on your part to finally step forward publicly. But Renata, based on what I'm seeing here, you may eventually own everything Preston built. I had no idea, sitting in that office absorbing the full scope of what justice might actually require and eventually provide, exactly how much longer I'd need to remain hidden before that possibility became real. The fourth year brought the piece of evidence that finally transformed our careful, methodical case from strong circumstantial documentation into something considerably more damning. Marcus, continuing his investigation into the original hiking trip, tracked down a maintenance worker at the remote lodge where we'd stayed. A quiet man named Theo Kessler who'd been repairing equipment near the trailhead the afternoon Preston, and I had hiked toward that overlook. Theo, it turned out, had witnessed something from a distance he'd never fully reported, partly out of uncertainty about what he'd actually seen, partly out of fear given Preston's local influence and wealth in the small coastal community. I saw two people standing near the edge, Theo told Marcus, in testimony that would eventually become central to our case. I saw one of them push the other. I told myself for years that maybe I'd misread the distance, misread what I was seeing. But when the story came out afterward, that the girl had simply wandered off alone, something never sat right with me. I should have said something sooner. I'm sorry it took this long. Theo's testimony, combined with Marcus's exhaustive financial documentation and Yusuf's careful legal preparation, finally gave us something comprehensive enough to consider moving toward public revelation. I want to be honest about how terrifying that prospect felt, even after 4 years of careful preparation. Revealing my survival meant not just confronting Preston directly, but confronting my mother, confronting a world that had spent years believing I was dead, confronting the strange, disorienting reality of stepping back into a life I'd been forced to abandon so abruptly. Delphine sat with me during many of the difficult conversations that preceded our final decision, helping me process not just the practical logistics of revelation, but the genuine grief underneath everything. Grief for 4 years of my life spent hidden, grief for relationships paused indefinitely, grief for the version of myself who'd once trusted a stepfather enough to stand beside him at a cliff's edge without a single moment of suspicion. You're allowed to grieve this, Delphine told me gently, during one particularly difficult evening. Justice doesn't erase what was taken from you, Renata. It just makes sure it can't keep being taken. Yusuf began preparing the legal framework for our public revelation during this period, coordinating carefully with law enforcement to ensure Preston couldn't simply flee or destroy remaining evidence once my survival became known. I had no idea, finalizing those preparations during the final months of my 4th year in hiding, exactly how the actual moment of revelation would unfold, or how completely it would upend the careful, controlled life Preston had spent 5 years building on the foundation of my presumed death. We chose Preston's own quarterly shareholders meeting for the revelation, a decision Yusuf recommended specifically because it would place the confrontation in a context with maximum documentation, numerous witnesses, and legal representatives already present who could immediately begin processing the implications. I spent the morning of that meeting in a hotel room 3 blocks from Ashford Logistics headquarters, Delphine helping me dress in a simple, professional suit, Marcus reviewing final logistics with the law enforcement officers who would be present, discreetly, throughout the proceedings. You don't have to do this exactly this way, Delphine reminded me gently, watching my hands tremble slightly as I fastened the final button on my jacket. There are other options, quieter options, if this feels like too much. No, I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice actually sounded. He took 5 years of my life through a lie told in private. I want the truth told in public, exactly where he built his empire on top of my presumed death. I walked into Ashford Logistics headquarters that afternoon flanked by Yusuf and 2 law enforcement officers positioned discreetly nearby. Walking through a lobby I remembered clearly from years earlier, past employees who glanced at me with vague, unplaceable recognition that hadn't yet crystallized into full understanding. The boardroom itself was already filled when I arrived, shareholders and board members settling into their seats for what they believed would be an entirely ordinary quarterly meeting, Preston standing at the head of the table in a tailored suit, radiating the same confident, controlled authority I remembered from years earlier, utterly unaware of what was about to unfold. I watched recognition arrive on his face in stages as I walked through that boardroom door, confusion first, then disbelief, then, unmistakably, fear. An expression I'd waited 5 years to witness on a man who'd once seemed so completely certain he'd eliminated every consequence of what he'd done to me. "Renata," he said, his voice barely audible, the entire room falling into stunned silence around him. "Hello, Preston," I said, my voice carrying clearly through that suddenly silent boardroom. "I understand you told everyone I wandered off alone." I watched every board member and shareholder in that room slowly turn to look between us, understanding beginning to dawn that whatever quarterly business they'd expected to discuss had just been completely, permanently superseded. I had no idea, standing in that doorway watching 5 years of careful hiding finally collide with the man who'd caused it, exactly how the following minutes would unfold, or how completely they would reshape everything Preston had spent those same 5 years building. "This is impossible," Preston said, his voice cracking slightly, control visibly slipping in a way I'd never once witnessed from him during years of watching his carefully managed public composure. "You died. You wandered off during that hike. Everyone knows what happened." "Everyone knows what you told them happened," I corrected, walking further into the boardroom, feeling the weight of dozens of stunned stares as board members and shareholders slowly began registering the actual implications of what they were witnessing. "I know what actually happened, Preston. I was there. I remember your hand on my shoulder. I remember you pushing me off that cliff." The gasp that moved through that boardroom felt almost physical, a collective intake of breath as 5 years of accepted narrative began collapsing in real time. "That's a lie," Preston said, though his voice had lost most of its earlier authority, panic beginning to bleed through his carefully maintained composure. "She's clearly confused, traumatized, this is." "A maintenance worker named Theo Kessler witnessed you push me," I interrupted, my voice remaining steady despite the enormous effort that steadiness required. "He's given a full statement to investigators. There's also considerable financial documentation regarding exactly why you needed me gone before I discovered what you'd done to circumvent my father's will regarding his original company." I watched Preston's face drain of color entirely, watched several board members exchange increasingly alarmed glances, watched the 2 law enforcement officers who'd accompanied us step forward from where they'd been positioned discreetly near the boardroom's entrance. "Preston Ashford," one of the officers said, his voice cutting cleanly through the chaos of the room, "we need you to come with us. You're being placed under arrest for attempted murder, fraud, and several related charges we'll be detailing further at the station." I watched my stepfather, the man who'd once seemed so completely untouchable, so confidently certain of his own impunity, being led out of the boardroom he'd spent years ruling with practiced authority, his expression finally, permanently stripped of every ounce of that former control. Yusuf stepped forward once Preston had been escorted out, addressing the stunned board members and shareholders with careful, measured professionalism. "I understand this is an enormous shock to process. I'll be available to answer questions regarding the legal implications for Ashford Logistics moving forward, but I want to introduce you, formally, to Renata Ashford, who, given the fraud documented regarding her father's original company and considering additional evidence currently under review, will be assuming a significant ownership role in this company moving forward." I stood in that boardroom, 5 years after falling from a cliff my stepfather pushed me from, watching the foundation of everything he'd built finally, completely collapse. I had no idea, standing there absorbing the weight of that moment, exactly how much would still need to unfold before I fully understood what significant ownership role would actually come to mean. The months following that boardroom revelation unfolded as a complicated blend of legal proceedings, media attention I'd never fully prepared myself for, and the slow, careful work of rebuilding relationships I'd been forced to abandon for 5 years. My mother's reaction, when I finally saw her again 3 days after the boardroom confrontation, remains one of the most emotionally complicated moments of my entire life. She collapsed in the doorway of the small apartment where Marcus had arranged our reunion, sobbing in a way that carried both overwhelming relief and devastating guilt in equal measure. "I should have known," she said over and over, through tears neither of us could fully stop. "I should have seen what he was doing to both of us. Marcus's earlier assessment proved accurate through the following months of investigation. My mother had indeed been deliberately isolated and manipulated by Preston during her most vulnerable period following my father's death. Her access to information carefully controlled, her grief and anxiety managed through medications that, upon later review, appeared to have been calibrated more toward compliance than genuine treatment. We spent months slowly rebuilding our relationship, therapy sessions together helping us process both my 5 years of hidden survival and her own complicated victimization within a marriage she'd entered believing, genuinely. Thus she'd found stability and love after devastating loss. The legal proceedings against Preston moved forward methodically, Theo Kessler's testimony proving crucial alongside the extensive financial documentation Marcus had compiled across 4 years of careful investigation. The pattern of predatory acquisitions extended even further than initially discovered, ultimately implicating Preston in fraud affecting several other companies and families beyond just my own. He was convicted, eventually, on charges including attempted murder and extensive financial fraud, sentenced to a term that ensured he would spend the remainder of his active adult life incarcerated. I want to be honest that his conviction, while providing genuine relief and vindication, didn't erase 5 years of stolen life, didn't undo the trauma of that fall or the strange, suspended existence I'd been forced to maintain while Marcus and Yusuf and Delphine helped me build the case that finally exposed him. But it did, finally, completely, dismantle the lie he'd built his continued success upon, the false narrative of my disappearance that had allowed him to consolidate power and wealth while I fought, quietly and patiently, to reclaim my own life. I had no idea, watching that conviction finally secured, exactly how thoroughly the following restructuring of Ashford Logistics would ultimately transform not just my own circumstances, but the entire company Preston had built on foundations of manipulation and theft. It's been 18 months now since that boardroom revelation, and I sit, most days, at the head of a conference table in an office that once belonged entirely to Preston Ashford, now serving as controlling owner and CEO of what we've renamed Meridian Logistics, a fresh start built on the same infrastructure Preston constructed, but finally, completely severed from the fraud and manipulation underlying its original foundation. The restructuring process, once full legal proceedings concluded, revealed exactly how extensive Preston's predatory pattern had actually been. Several of the companies he'd fraudulently acquired over the years were returned, where possible, to original owners or their surviving families, a process I insisted upon despite Yusuf's initial concerns about the financial complexity involved. This isn't just about what he took from me, I told him, during one of our many strategic planning sessions. It's about what he took from everyone. I'm not interested in simply inheriting his empire intact. I'm interested in dismantling everything built on theft and rebuilding something legitimate in its place. Marcus now consults for our company's internal investigations division, helping us identify and address any remaining irregularities from Preston's tenure. Delphine serves on our board, her steady, protective presence having earned my complete trust across 5 years of careful, patient collaboration. Theo Kessler received a substantial settlement, though what he tells me matters more to him is simply the relief of finally having spoken the truth he'd carried silently for years. My mother and I have rebuilt something genuine between us, careful and imperfect, but real, strengthened rather than diminished by the shared trauma we've slowly learned to process together rather than separately. I think often about that afternoon on the cliff, about the specific sound of falling through open air, about the strange, extended silence of 5 years spent hidden while I built, piece by careful piece, the case that would eventually expose everything Preston tried to bury alongside my presumed death. People ask me sometimes what sustained me through those hidden years, through surgeries and physical therapy and the strange, suspended existence of watching my own life continue without me from a careful, protected distance. I tell them the truth. I survived because survival became its own form of testimony, proof that Preston's carefully constructed lie could never actually erase what had genuinely happened on that cliffside. Regardless of how convincingly he told the story to everyone who believed him. He pushed me off a cliff and told the world I had simply wandered off alone. 5 years later, I walked into his boardroom, and the world finally learned exactly what he'd actually done, and exactly who I'd become in the silence he thought would last forever. The end.